Can Scott explain the pros and cons between Mongo, NoSQL versus traditional SQL databases like MS SQL, Oracle, Postgres?
Wow, that's a very, I could talk about that for a week. And I know everybody says this, but like it really depends on your app. But I can tell you from practical use, from my experience and the different types of apps that I've built, the pros and cons. So pros for Mongo for me was that it was just easier to get started with without having to like fight a database with all of its restrictions to get something going. I mean, you would see just in a couple lines, we were able to spin up a database and throw some data in it without having to think about things like foreign keys and primary keys and IDs and like all that stuff. We were able to just spin something up. So it's really great to get started. So that's one thing. Two, it is very flexible. Although we do have a schema. You saw in the first attempt when I created a student, I didn't have to add a first name, and it just doesn't matter because it wasn't required. So it just adds it there, and it won't freak out about it. So that can be good or bad, but it's just really flexible to get started. Three, the other thing that I've realized is that when it comes to shaping data, it's really flexible because it's just JSON by default. Sure, Postgres now has support for like JSON-B, I think, where you can just like store a JSON in Postgres, but how you query that JSON and how you store it is two different things. I don't think you can query the JSON in Postgres the same way you could query JSON in Mongo because all the keys are actually like fields in Mongo, whereas in JSON it's just JSON. So there's a difference there. The other thing about Mongo is that it's kind of built like with JavaScript in mind and Node in mind, so it's like event-based, and it takes advantage of that architecture, which is really easy to work with. So that's why I think Mongoose itself has like one of the best ORMs. It's promise-based, it's modern, like it kind of just works with everything, whereas a lot of other databases, like this just wasn't made for Node, and you kind of got to finesse it to do a lot of work. If you've never had to use like Postgres and Node, then good for you. If you did, you know what I'm talking about. And then when you get into like performance reasons and scaling and all that stuff, I think at the higher end, if you're like the Googles of the world, I think Postgres and SQL is probably going to perform better for you. I think it's just a more complete database at that end. I mean, Postgres and SQL has been around forever. There's just so much support on it. It's been ACID compliant for a while. Mongo's getting there. They're just now becoming ACID compliant. They have transactions, and they're definitely getting there. But I would say because Postgres and SQL has been around for much longer, it's probably just going to be better for you. There's just more support for those types of databases. I mean, if you go to AWS, there's just so many different types of SQL databases. Sure, they have Dynamo, but they also have like Aurora, which is like a serverless SQL database. And like pretty much everybody has some SQL something. So because of support, I would say it's probably better if you're the Googles of the world. But for everybody else, I think Mongo is just great. It's just fantastic to get going. But yeah, I think it really depends on your applications because if you have like high writes or low reads or high reads and high writes, it's really going to depend on what the application is and what type of server it's running on. Like, are you running Mongo on Python? Or are you running it on Node? That really all depends. So it's really hard to compare apples to apples. But from my experience, Mongo has just been a pleasure. I haven't run into a problem where I was like, I absolutely need SQL right now. It's the only solution that's going to help me. I've never run into that problem. So yeah, yes.
Maybe you answered this, but what is Mongo written in? Is it written in C? Is it written in C++?
Yeah, it's written in a lot of things. You know what? I'm not going to try to answer that. Let's go see if we can find that out right now. I don't think it is on GitHub. I want to say it's mostly written in C++. But I know it's written in a lot of things. So here we go. Yeah, C++. So it's mostly written in C++, but as you can see, like I said, it's a lot of things. We got JavaScript, Python, Go, Shell, Java, and then other, whatever that is. So yeah, it's mostly C++, but yeah, it's written in a lot of things. And that's why it's like pretty compatible with JavaScript because like V8, C++, so yeah, it's a pretty good database.
What are the ideal situations or applications to use Mongo and versus relational DB?
Yes, almost every time. No, that's such a bad answer. I sound like I'm selling Mongo over here. Like I need like a Mongo cape. I would say for like simple apps, definitely Mongo. Like it's just so easier. The time you save starting and getting back to the app is just free. And then any app where like the shape changes constantly. Like for instance, a CMS. If you're building a CMS and like you allow people to create their own custom shapes, their own custom types, their own custom schemas, you need something that can like change schemas. So like Mongo's perfect for that because it's like forgiving. It's just like, yeah, you can just do whatever you want. Whereas if you use something like Postgres, you'd have to run a migration every single time somebody changed one thing. So it can get pretty annoying, and the developer cost for that can just be ridiculous. Running migrations, if you had like some globally deployed architecture and you're running migration on a primary, now you got to block everything, and then you got to like, write it concerned to these other databases. It can just get pretty annoying there. So I think Mongo is just really good for those types of applications. I also think it's really good for like real-time applications that just like for things like chats and stuff like that. It's just perfect because you can just store the data the exact same way that you need it without having to do different types of formats. You can just store an array of things and it'll scale up until it hits the document collection limit, or you can do relational if you want. So I think those type of applications are the best, in my opinion. Yeah, but I wouldn't use it for something like a social network, where it's like you need graphs, right? You need graph. Yeah, you can do graph looks up in Mongo, and that's really advanced. But I wouldn't default to a Mongo database for like a graph scenario or a time series database where I'm like doing analytics. I wouldn't use it in that scenario. I would use it in pretty much any scenario where I'm just building a traditional application and not something that's like specific to something like graphs, time series, or something like that. Yeah.
Would you recommend it for e-commerce applications?
Oh, it's perfect for e-commerce applications. That's basically a CMS. Yeah, it's fantastic for e-commerce applications. Like, yeah, those types of apps is where it's good at. It's just a traditional, hardcore, like not gonna surprise you app. Nothing that's like, you're doing machine learning models with real-time WebSockets that's like spitting out an audit log. Like, no, that's just crazy. You could do that in Mongo, but it's gonna be pretty complicated.
Can we store blob data types? Like, from WYSIWYG editors, you can get like a bunch of HTML and stuff combined, and then you can store it in MySQL databases.
Yep, you can store it in whatever form type you want. In fact, I do that on my application that we built. We have tons of editors, and we just store it as that. At the end of the day, you can store however you want, any way that you want, and you can run validations on it too.
So that also like replications, you can create
It actually uses that for replication, yeah. So you don't have to do replication yourself if you use something like Atlas, MongoDB Atlas, their hosting provider, so they do replication for you, but they use that technique to do replication where they have like primary, secondary. So yeah, they'll do that for you, but you can also subscribe to it yourself and do all types of things. We use it to actually create an audit log on the front end for like activity on like a company's profile. Like here's everything that users has been doing in the last 20 days, and then we'll just format it and show you. So we do stuff like that. So yeah, I wouldn't let, if I had to create a database for something that's like 2 years old, then yeah, I would just make sure I don't have to create a database for something 2 years old and just send it somewhere else. Like that should be like an S3 file somewhere, I would say. That way you can just go ask S3, like give me all the logs from the database for like the last 2 years for this customer, and that should be like backed up in S3 or Glacier on AWS, somewhere like that.
Or Redis?
Or probably not Redis because that's like long-term storage, right? Redis is just like short-term in memory, and it's volatile. It'll be erased once you restart everything. Like you definitely want to put that in like some cheap storage that's never almost going to be touched. So like literally Glacier is what AWS uses for that.